In this video, we'll focus on laying the foundation for all of the triangle congruence proofs that we're going to write throughout the year. So this video will contain a lot of basic introductory skills that will be necessary for your success, both in this unit and later on. All right, let's go ahead and get right down to business here. In this first example, we are given that segment AR is perpendicular to segment CB. We're given that line segment AR bisects angle CAB, and we're being asked to prove that triangle ACR is congruent to triangle ABR. Now, the first and probably the most important thing that we're going to do with all of these proofs is use the given information to mark the diagram. This is so important that I'm going to take a minute and write this down, and you should on your paper too. Mark all, and I'm going to underline all given information in the diagram. Often when I have kids who have difficulty or encounter difficulty writing the proof, one of the biggest places that they've made their mistake or tripped themselves up is that they haven't marked all of the given information in the diagram. And that's why it's so important. It helps you get set up to be successful in everything that you're going to write about later on. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to mark all given information in the proof, or in the diagram, excuse me. So the first thing I have to do is mark this first given, these perpendicular lines. Recall that this symbol, this upside down T, means the word perpendicular. And perpendicular means forms right angles. So in other words, where these two line segments, AR and CB, come together, we have some right angles that are being formed. So I need to mark right angles where the two purple segments come together in the picture. So I've now marked that given information in the diagram. The second piece of information that I need to mark is that segment AR bisects angle CAB. So if I look in the picture, angle CAB is this angle up at the top of my triangle. Bisects, remember, means makes two congruent parts. So segment AR will split the green angle into two congruent parts. And it's those two congruent parts that I need to go ahead and I need to mark in my diagram. So those two angles up at the top of the picture. I'm trying to prove congruent triangles. So in trying to prove congruent triangles, recall from the previous lesson that we can either prove triangles congruent using side, 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 side angle, side, or angle, side, angle. Those are the three that we know of right now. So in looking at this picture, I have a pair of congruent angles at the top of my picture and a pair of congruent angles down here at the bottom. And it just so happens that AR up the middle is a pair of shared sides and is going to be a pair of congruent sides. So the method that I'm going to use to prove these triangles congruent is angle, side, angle. This over here where I just wrote angle, side, angle is going to become the outline for our proof. This is another area where kids will often kind of fall off track and that they'll fail to write the outline. The outline is really important because it talks about what you're going to say in your proof, or it outlines exactly what it is that you're going to write about. So I need to write about two pairs of congruent angles along with a pair of congruent sides. The two pairs of congruent angles, well, one of the two pairs of congruent angles that I'm going to write about is this pair up at the top, angle 1 congruent to angle 2. And if I wanted, I could call those angles CAR and angle BIR, but I'm going to call them angles 1 and 2 for short. I need to talk about my pair of congruent sides. Well, the sides are AR and AR, that shared pair right up the middle. And I need to talk about a second pair of congruent angles. I'm going to call them, for lack of something better, angles 3 and 4 down at the bottom of my triangles. Now, if I was given a pair of congruent angles, like if I was told angle CRA was congruent to angle BRA, I'd have to use the name that was given to them in the given information. But because nobody has given us anything about these angles, I can really name them anything that I want to. This outline is really important because it, in essence, talks about all the things I need to write about in my proof. Somewhere in my proof, I need to write about angle 1 being congruent to angle 2. I know I need to write about them being congruent to each other. And if I go back to my given information, it's not given anywhere that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. But the piece of information that I used to make those two congruent to each other was this whole notion about the angle bisector. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and start the writing of my proof. I'm going to start by talking about segment AR bisecting angle CAB. I know that's a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. And then using that angle bisector was the clue that told me that these two angles, angles 1 and 2, are congruent to one another. Because they're a pair of congruent angles in the triangles I'm trying to prove congruent, I'm going to put a little a in parentheses after writing angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Just a little reminder, if you're having difficulty coming up with a reason down here, I want you to go and find the most important word in the preceding statement. And the most important word in the preceding statement is that word bisects. That's how I want to start my reason. It's that angle bisector that forms or makes or creates the two congruent angles. So if I think about my outline over here as my little checklist, I've now talked or written about angle 1 being congruent to angle 2 in my proof. So that part of the job is done. I'm going to go on to the part now where I have to talk about these congruent sides. We know that segment AR is congruent to segment AR because they're a shared pair of sides up the middle. And when we write our proof, we have a special name for that. And the special name that we give to that is called the reflexive property. The reflexive property says very simply something that you've known all along to be true. And that is any number is equal to itself. Any fraction is equal to itself. Any geometric shape such as AR is equal to itself. That's what the reflexive property says. Anything is equal to itself. So again, if I think about my outline as a little checklist, now I can go ahead and check off my pair of congruent sides because I've included them in my proof. Because they're a pair of sides in the triangles that I'm trying to prove congruent, I'm going to indicate that in my proof by putting a little S there in parentheses. So at this point, I'm 2 down, 1 to go. The last thing I need to talk about or discuss in my writing before I can say these triangles are congruent is this whole notion of angle 3 being congruent to angle 4. That was not information that was given to me in the given information. However, I used the fact that these two lines are perpendicular in order to be able to say those angles are congruent. So my discussion is going to begin by saying that AR is perpendicular to segment CB. I know this is a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. It doesn't have anything to do with the sides or the other set of angles, and that's why I'm starting a brand new branch over here. Due to the fact that these two segments are perpendicular to each other, that tells me that the angles that are formed at point A, angle 3 and angle 4, are right angles. It doesn't tell me anything about them being congruent yet, but that word perpendicular means forms right angles. So I know that angle 3 and angle 4 are right angles. And again, if you're struggling for something to write as to a reason, go back to the preceding bubble, look for the most important word. The most important word there is the word perpendicular. So that's how I'm going to begin my reason. Perpendicular lines form right angles, or make right angles, or create right angles. And then I know that all right angles have to be congruent to one another. I've got these two angles that are right angles. Because they're both right angles, now I can go ahead and say they're congruent. And the reason for that is because I know that anybody who's a right angle or all right angles are congruent. These two are a pair of congruent angles, and the triangles I'm trying to show are congruent, so I'm going to mark a little A in parentheses there. So at this point now, everybody on my little checklist that I needed to talk about in order to make these two triangles congruent, my two pairs of congruent angles and my pair of congruent sides, I've talked about. So now I can pull all 3 of these steps together and go ahead and I can conclude that triangle ACR is congruent to triangle ABR. And as for my reasoning here is angle side angle. So that's kind of a lot to absorb and a lot to digest. We've learned a lot of new information. I am going to go ahead and present the second proof, which will make this kind of a long video. So if you need to take a break, you may want to pause the video right now so that you can do what you need to do, or take your break so that you can come back focused and ready to take a look at the second example. Like the first example, the very first thing that I'm going to do in number 2 is go ahead and mark all of the given information in my diagram. So point T is the midpoint of segment PQ. PQ is that segment I just outlined in blue. We know a midpoint will split a segment into 2 equal parts. So in other words, T is splitting that blue line segment into 2 equal parts, making segment PT congruent to segment TQ. So I've marked that in the picture. I'm going to go on to the next one. Segment PQ bisects segment RS. Well, segment RS is that green segment. I know a bisector splits into 2 equal parts. So in other words, that green line segment is being split into 2 equal parts. And note that I'm going to mark them in such a way that they are congruent to each other, but not to the blue segments that I marked from the first given. So now that second given is marked, I'm going to check it off and go on to the third one. The third one says segment RQ is simply congruent to segment SP. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those congruent. So as far as an outline or a plan, I'm seeing prove these 2 triangles congruent by side, side, side. Side, side, side would be a great, marvelous, wonderful way to prove these triangles congruent. I'm also seeing the vertical angles at point T. So not only could you do side, 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 side in order to make these triangles congruent, but also it would be a good plan as well to prove the triangles congruent by side, angle, side. I want to demonstrate to you how to put vertical angles into a proof. So I'm actually going to prove the triangles congruent by side, angle, side. So I'm going to go back into my picture and erase the pair of sides that I don't need to have congruent. So if I'm going to prove the triangles congruent by side, angle, side, I need to talk about segment PT being congruent to segment TQ. I need to talk in my proof about these vertical angles. I'm going to call them 1 and 2 being congruent. And I need to talk in my proof about segment RT being congruent to segment TS. Those are the 3 pairs of congruent parts that I need in order to make these triangles congruent to each other. Now, the order in which they appear in the diagram is very important, because angles 1 and 2 would have to be the included angles, which they are, in order to prove these triangles congruent by side, angle, side. But what's kind of neat is the order in which you discuss them in your proof doesn't matter. You can discuss them in any order that you'd like. So I think, just to be a little rebel here, I'm going to start by talking about angles 1 and 2 being congruent to each other rather than a pair of congruent sides. So I'm going to begin my proof with this idea that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. It is a pair of congruent angles in the triangles I'm trying to show congruent, so I'm going to mark that with an A. And I know those 2 angles are congruent because they're vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. So if I think about this as my little checklist, check it off. I need to now talk about segments PT and TQ being congruent. The reason I knew they were congruent is due to the midpoint. So I need to go have a little discussion about the midpoint, which doesn't have anything to do with the vertical angles. So I'm going to go start a new branch of my proof. Incidentally, if you're more comfortable writing statements reasons, you're certainly more than welcome to do that. But that midpoint is what makes segment PT congruent to segment TQ. There are a pair of congruent sides in the triangles I'm trying to make congruent, so I'm going to mark them with an S. And the reason here is that midpoint makes 2 congruent segments. And now I can go back to my little checklist and check that off. And lastly, I need to talk about segment RT being congruent to segment TS. And the reason I knew those 2 were congruent to each other was due to the fact that PQ bisected segment RS. So I'm going to go make mention of that. And that segment bisector is what told me that segment RT was congruent to segment TS, which also is a pair of congruent sides in the triangles I'm trying to make congruent. So the bisector is what makes these congruent segments. So at this point now, I've written about everything in my little checklist. I've written about those 2 pairs of congruent sides. I've written about the pair of congruent angles. Now I've set myself up perfectly to go ahead and draw the conclusion or make the conclusion that these 2 triangles must be congruent to each other. And the reason these 2 are congruent is by side angle side. And of course, remember, if you had wanted to use side, 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 you could have done that just as nicely for this proof. I know I've been a bit long-winded in this video, but I hope that you got some really important and useful knowledge out of it that's going to help you become a better, stronger, more successful proof writer. But I do want to express my appreciation for bearing with me and making it through the video and the time and the energy that you put in. As always, I do want you to summarize the key ideas and the important takeaways. And then why don't you see just what you can do with number 2 on that next page, since I was very long in the video.